Good afternoon. I will start with a quote letter by Konstantinos Doxiadis found in the Doxiadis archives, and I quote, "For the past week, due to political action, I have been dismissed from office after the abolition of the post and now find myself entirely out of service. The first permanent undersecretary in the Greek parliament, in the presence of 42 out of 250 deputies, 5 of them managed to pay me for my non-cooperation in their political plans," end quote. The banality and chaos of post-World War II Athens, characterized by polykatikia housing, largely informally produced, is widely known. What is not that well known or appreciated is that during the Second World War and German occupation, a young and ambitious architect, Konstantinos Doxiadis, 1913 to 1975, was diligently trying to plan and implement a different future for Athens. But he was suddenly dismissed from his post, as the letter I just read indicates, while in hospital suffering from exhaustion in a quasi-legal fashion in December 1950, and his wartime contribution to what he called the future of Athens has been suppressed, if not deliberately misinterpreted, as if for a very long time Greek architectural historians have waged war against him. The onset of civil war shortly after the end of World War II, 1946 to 49, as well as the fact that during the post-war military junta, 67 to 74, Doxiadis won 2 large state contracts, neither of which was implemented, has contributed to antagonism towards him among Greek intellectuals that is only now starting to shift. In his widely read and very respected history, Athens from the 19th to the 20th centuries, published in 1966, architect and planner Kostas Biris, a colleague of Doxiadis in his first government post, featured his own plans for Athenian reconstruction, produced in 1945, claiming that the unnamed person heading the Ministry of Reconstruction after the war had been completely unable to do justice to his post, confining this negative criticism and a few other details about Doxiadis' wartime work to his footnotes. Whereas in my doctoral work I tried to recover exactly what Doxiadis achieved during this period, today I will focus on, speculate upon the ways in which war and occupation contributed to the development of a very specific working method. Why or what did this method mean for Doxiadis, and perhaps even more broadly for the conceptual foundations of the discipline of planning, still at that point a relatively new field. So I will discuss what I see as 3 instances of Doxiadis' method, which in my opinion are linked to 3 conceptualizations of the notion of the archive, and I will try to explain that. So the first part is scouts, secrets, codes. Doxiadis returned from his PhD studies in Berlin, Charlottenburg in 1937. He became chief town planning officer for the greater Athens area. At that point, he believed naively that he could radically change the ways in which the state worked. Having been given a great deal of responsibility despite his young age, he was 24, he assigned himself the position of archon, the head archivist, a self-appointed one, who collected, kept, organized, and classified all information. The word archive is derived from archi, meaning government or order. Archive, archion, is the home of the archon, where official state documents are kept, and thus it's an expression of power, state power. It's a secret storehouse for protecting. It has keys and sort of ways to enter it, codes that are very specific, and the way it maps information out into the outside world. Indeed, one of the first assignments Doxiadis set himself was to collect as much information as possible about settlements in Greece. He persuaded the Greek government to undertake a housing census as part of the first general national census of 1940. He obtained the sheets from the statistical office and added many of his own detailed questions. He then organized a large team to study this information. He set up a special unit within this government post that he called Office for Town Planning and Research, which was in charge of research, which for him was a very magical word, I feel. They produced extensive surveys that encompass both visual and written information in the form of, quote, multidimensional tables, fantastically detailed maps of cities like Athens, with densities by building block established from air photos used as a basis for various density models. Time was projected into the future and structure of settlements in terms of neighborhoods and communities, end quote. Most of this information, and particularly the maps and models, was lost, burned in an office fire. We think that this could be one of these maps, and this one here, shown with an unidentified figure posing next to it for scale. But the idea of collecting and designing the collection of information remains central to Doxiadis' work. This archival drive or impulse, the ongoing gathering of facts, should be seen, I think, against the specific historical background and legacy of 400-year occupation that I think made Doxiadis feel as if contemporary Greece was still a quasi-foreign country. His desire to collect the present also had something to do with a wish to build and understand the past, create a national story, which at that point was still very much under construction. World War II broke up what was a relatively recently formed nation. Even though the Greek state was founded in 1834, there was actually a gradual process of independence, territory incorporation that lasted until as late as World War I in some places, Crete 1913, the Dodecanese instead 1947, and was fraught with conflict and difficulty. When Italy attacked Greece in October 1940, Doxiadis fought on the Albanian front. Upon returning to Athens as a corporal in the Greek army and resuming his government post, he founded an underground intelligence organization that became the, quote, scientific general staff of the resistance movement. In fact, it's now apparent that Doxiadis turned his official post as chief town planner into a way to gather information for the resistance, working with a so-called Midas 614 group. This unit deployed hundreds of architects and engineers throughout Greece, who often risked their lives to collect data and intelligence. Quote, they supplied information on rail transportation and bridges and the types of facilities that could be targets for the resistance, as well as general information about the working of the occupied state and the military works conducted by occupation forces, end quote. These scouts were technical staff, young architects and civil engineers, men and women whose pictures we see here, mostly still unidentified. Doxiadis was again the Archon, the central intelligence, who collected and classified all information. Now, second part of the talk, ethnographic flaneurs. At the same time as the activities of the scouts, Doxiadis organized a clandestine series of weekly meetings among his closest collaborators. The so-called, what he called, circle of technologists, or technical specialists in my translation, in Greek, kyklos technikon, held in Athens to discuss and exchange ideas and information. The proceedings were recorded in a journal called Chorotaxia, a single copy of which survives in the Doxiadis archive from 1942. The purpose of these meetings and texts was to prepare the ground for post-war reconstruction. The topics of the circle were interdisciplinary: architecture, aerial photography, geography, map-making, statistics, the language debate. Each member would present one area of his or her expertise to the others. What exactly were they gathering? Doxiadis, I quote, 11 members of the circle undertook to work on presentations on housing, dividing the work between themselves and countries. There was a questionnaire designed. The results were typified. The approach to each problem was unified. The presentations were then prepared by each responsible member with a view to showing the problems as much as possible, while the rest of the material will remain in the archives of the circle, end quote. There is no time here to discuss the presentations in much detail, except to mention a couple and refer to Doxiadis' contribution, which, among other things, was the introduction of the discipline of planning to Greece. The term he came up to describe it, chorotaxia, the journal's title, means literally to bring order, taxis, to choro, space. One word I found in Doxiadis' writings from the early 40s, the word akatastasia, which means untidy, messy, evokes and embodies the spirit of this period as it comes through these discussions. Doxiadis wrote, planning is a completely new concept that represents a need that arose due to the chaos created on the surface of the earth by the disorder, akatastasia, with which structures have been appearing throughout the capitalist period, end quote. Doxiadis used akatastasia to describe the state of the country. It was a mess. According to him, centuries of occupation had not allowed for proper organization of settlements. There were no public buildings, few public squares, villages were constructed in the wrong places, and the country was literally in pieces. So from akatastasia to chorotaxia, Doxiadis saw planning as domestic housekeeping, and he saw himself as bringing order, what he called eliminating chaos, tidying up. He said, the first task of the technical scientist is to study and organize, and the project of archiving fit into this conceptually. The quest for gathering knowledge and tidying up modern-day Greece has to also be seen against the background of the discipline of laography, from laos, the people, and graphie, writing, text, the study of everyday life and material culture of rural Greece. Laography flourished during the 20s and 30s, particularly, some claim, due to the self-searching that followed the failed war against Turkey of 1921 to 22, and the painful ensuing retreat, as it provided a new connection between the illiterate Laos and the idea of a new Hellenic state. Even though essentially identical to ethnography, since ethnos means nation in Greek, laography rather than ethnography became the prevalent term still used to this day. The laographers of the circle worked as ethnographic flaneurs, wandering the Greek countryside, observing, recording aspects of everyday life in a kind of disengaged, a kind of defamiliarized way. What exactly were they gathering? And what did it mean to wander the Greek countryside of the 30s and 40s? And there are no images in Chorotaxia, so I've put up some images from their work previously. Visiting the Greek countryside at the time must have been incredibly difficult, as the rural world was particularly isolated. There were few roads, almost no public transportation, no electricity, etc. The wish for the accumulation and classification of material, then, needs to be seen through this larger project of pre-war Greek intellectuals, which was how to turn the oral, ephemeral, informal akatastasia of modern Greek culture after centuries of foreign rule into something written, formal, orderly, as well as more permanent. These intellectuals wished to transcribe rural life, to literally write it down, to assemble as many expressions of local oral culture as possible and make it accessible, save it for posterity. Not unlike the idea of collecting intelligence and data, the difference being that these were cultural artifacts, not bridges, tunnels, and boundaries, but fairy tales, demotic songs, poems, stories, as well as the arts and crafts of the Laos. Two of the country's most prominent laographers were invited to speak at the circle meetings, Georgios Megas and Angeliki Hadjimichali. Hadjimichali, an upper-middle-class artist who was particularly active in the resistance, spent much of her life living in isolated rural communities, with those she observed and wrote about in the 20s, from the 20s until her death in 1965, working to make everyday ordinary culture and life world visible. She studied the Aegean Islands, especially Skiros, as well as the Sarakatsans, a nomadic population, with an emphasis on women's everyday life, the house, and particularly the interior, utensils, clothing, woodwork, embroideries, social life and rituals, the ways of life, as well as the artistic expressions within it, celebratory dress, wedding beads, dowry items, etc. Megas worked on settlements and dwellings in northern Greece, close to the border with Turkey. He sought to find out how houses were built. He called this laiki ikodomia, which means, could be translated as something close to popular building science, but it's really not very used. He put that together. And also he was also concerned, though, with household utensils, rituals, and much more. Beyond communicating information, Megas and Hadjimichali's talks betray an interest in building up a vocabulary of terms as if to test and extend available language, which is evidence of a larger modernization program envisioned already before the end of the war. Within the context of Greek culture at this time, the Chorotaxia meetings make one more fact evident, that the language of architecture and planning was still up in the air, still being written. The circle of scientists contributed to this effort in very significant ways. It is not by chance that language scholars were invited to participate. Doxiadis kept inventing terms, many of which first appeared at this time, such as ekistics, chorographia, chronosia, chorotaxia, etc. This work continued well in the early post-war period, when Hadjimichali and Megas produced glossaries, and Zisimos Dzardzanos, another very obscure architect and son of a famous scholar of ancient Greek, published an incredible, I think, dictionary of building terms, translating popular terms of ordinary builders into scientific architectural language. In addition to providing a core group who promoted an intellectual structure for architecture and urbanism during the war, the very method and research in popular buildings outlined, particularly by Megas in these Chorotaxia meetings, was extremely influential for Doxiadis' own professional development. In the studies of Beirut and Iraq, circa 1958, conducted by what was by then a global architectural and planning practice, Doxiadis Associates, we find Doxiadis still using war terms, referring to his young engineers and architects as scouts, sent on extensive reconnaissance of existing settlements, transcribing local building cultures, working much like the wartime laugraphers. Third and final part of the talk, the ambition of totality. The last piece from the wartime material I'll discuss today is the large format Sacrifices of Greece During the Second World War catalog, printed in limited edition immediately after the end of the war. Written in text in 4 languages, Greek, French, English, and Russian, this catalog was designed to solicit foreign aid. It combined ethnography with social research and technical data. The aim was comprehensiveness, the desire to build a totality of facts. And I'm going to show images quite quickly. Some images, not all. The catalog was comprised of 90 different segments of information divided in 6 sections. These included many maps tracing the advance of Axis powers, as well as drawings where for each of the categories of information there was a specific graphic symbol. To explain losses in agricultural production, there were drawings of cereals, beans, tobacco, cotton, olives, grapes, currants, fruits, and must. To describe the reduction of livestock, there were drawings of heads of sheep, goats, pigs, chickens. Similarly, there were symbols for cars, trains, airplanes, boats, to illustrate the losses in both military and civilian infrastructure. There were also symbols of bridges, men, women, old people, babies, and homelessness. There was even a drawing about bread. Since Sacrifices of Greece and the accompanying exhibition panels were designed to appeal to an international public, and there were very few photographs such as these. It was important that the ways in which the information was conveyed was simplified and universally readable. It is the design and illustrations of this catalog. There was no perspective, the figures, flat, sharp contrast of figures against the white background, simplification, typification, etc., that give us a clue to the hypothesis that political economist and sociologist Otto Neurath, seen here with Gideon, must have been an important influence in Doxiadis' early career. Neurath had participated in the 4th CM meeting that took place in Athens and aboard the Greek ship Patris II, touring the Aegean Islands in 1933, where he had presented his work on the so-called Vienna method, also exhibited at the School of Architecture, where Doxiadis was a 3rd-year student at the time. His talk was then published in Technica Chronica, the Chronicles of Greek Architects and Engineers, and this is a page from that. Neurath's text was fully illustrated with what he later called isotype symbols. Comparing these images to hieroglyphics, Neurath proposed that his work should be seen as a new visual language that would be accompanied in due time by, quote, a new dictionary and illustrated catalog, end quote. Like Neurath, Doxiadis too shared an interest in understanding deeper economic and sociological realities of modernity. Sacrifices of Greece, then, may be understood as an effort to build yet another language, this time something maybe akin to an atlas, dictionary. Though the Sacrifices of Greece did not replicate Neurath's suggested symbols, they certainly were based upon them and elaborated them in new ways. This wartime material, forgotten today, seems to have moved and impressed the international press at the time. As a writer of the Architectural Forum noted, and I quote, "The delegates in the crowded committee room in San Francisco, where the exhibition was first shown, which I believe is the same material used for the catalog, had blinked at the sheaf of maps and plans which the Greek delegation brought to the session on economic and social cooperation. It was not hard to see, instead of the careful figures, the faces of the 250,000 who had stood in Athens' breadlines, the children who died in the streets, the smoldering ruins of 1,000 villages," end quote. Doxiadis, we see him on the left here, who accompanied the exhibition of this material at each step, delivered an emotive speech at the San Francisco meeting of August 1945 to ask for international aid, significantly linking the Second World War with the Greek struggle for independence from the Ottomans. Alongside this catalogue, Doxiadis began to produce a separate catalogue that had to do specifically with housing. This second catalogue, of roughly the same size and format as Sacrifices of Greece, seems to have remained incomplete, unfinished. This was to include 44 separate segments, with information such as maps showing rural versus urban populations, tables showing average income and rent, settlements provided with electricity or not, echoistic activity during 23 to 1940, etc. And I show you just a few images of that. Perhaps due to the destruction of the information during the fire, or simply due to lack of time, this catalogue was only sketched out with preliminary drawings and handwritten calculations. It is clear from the material I've been able to find in the Doxiadis archive to date that Doxiadis understood the importance of logistical organization gleaned during the period of war and occupation. His appreciation of wartime organization inspired him to counterplan, that is, to plan for peace during the war. His long life mission of preserving and classifying facts, developed during a period of wartime resistance, endowed this work with a special urgency. As a high-ranking government employee during the decade of the 40s, and subsequently as Minister Coordinator of the Greek Recovery Program, Under Secretary of Ministry of Coordination, we sense that he felt personally responsible to protect and organize the totality of knowledge about his country. The very practice of archiving, writing down, was not only about, for him, recovering the past, but also, in a way, inventing the future. Perhaps one can see all of Doxiadis' work as a form of future archiving with multiple forms and versions, recurring connective sequences, themes, obsessions. The scale of this ambition was impressive. At the same time, the infinity of the task, I think, kept defeating him. As Minister of Reconstruction, Doxiadis continued to send out scouts to the war-damaged Greek countryside. This is from the previous catalogue. With newly written and extremely detailed instructions on how and what to collect. And these are examples. The material was then organized by him into the many ministry reports and publications. There were at least 30 of those. And these are results of some of the scouts who went out during that time to document the Greek countryside. His model of secretive technical research developed during wartime, following highly rational methods, but also very strictly controlled for purposes of secrecy, resonates with the idea of the archive, a construction that I think he was very fond of. But his objectives were not quite as obvious or agreed upon in the post-war, and his method did not work as well. Was his obsessive collection of facts related to his working for foreign powers, as some of his opponents thought? Or was the negative reception of his work due to the fact that there was no structure in place for Doxiadis to implement these plans, as Greek society at that point was simply not ready for this level of planning that he envisioned? One thing seems clear: Doxiadis' obsessive ordering of facts, and this is one of the publications that I was talking about, became increasingly sophisticated after the war, as he had to manage a large international practice, and he in fact left, and this is evidenced by the fact that he left an exceptionally organized archive, the structure of which was an extension of his own classifications, and that was supplied daily by his collaborators. In Doxiadis' work from the 40s, and more publications from that time. In Doxiadis' work from the 40s, it is still hard to make sense of the irony of a wish for total mastery of facts, and at the same time losing sight of the reality of centers of power and ways of operating of those in power. It seems that this irony did not escape him. By 1961, with many of the members of the original ministry team still working as collaborators, Doxiadis' associates produced an important publication called Our Capital and Its Future, where once again they argued for a systematic policy towards the provision of shelter. Among other interesting, provocative, and visually sophisticated proposals, Doxiadis finally critically addressed Beiris' views on planning, although he too did not mention Beiris by name. Towards the end of Our Capital and Its Future, Doxiadis wrote, and I quote, "In closing, I wish to renew my appeal for the preparation of a program and plan for the future capital, so that by the end of 1961, the country may be able to announce that the plan is ready and that it will be carried out in succeeding years. As a Greek citizen and a specialist, I am loath to see so many other countries preparing similar programs, and furthermore with our assistance, without our being able to do the same in this country. Thank you.